Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a few more minutes so others can arrive and then we'll begin. Okay, thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining RPRA this morning for our consultation webinar for the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste Windup Plan Program Extension Addendum. My name is Michelle Hoover, and I am one of the communications advisors at RPRA and will be your co-host today. And Cameron Perrick, who is the Manager of Programs and Planning, will be hosting today's webinar, and he will introduce himself shortly. Next slide, please. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. So we will be answering questions in the middle and at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and click send. We've also turned on a feature to upvote a question, which allows you to bump up someone's question to the top of our queue. This can be valuable if you wanted to ask the same question or you are interested in hearing the answer. And hopefully this will allow us to answer it quicker. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please let us know by using the chat or Q&A feature. And for whatever reason, if we aren't able to answer your question during today's live webinar, we will be following up with you afterwards. And this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our consultation webpage afterwards, as well as the presentation slides for you to review. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today. So first, we're going to talk about the purpose of the consultation, why we're all here. And then Cameron will go into the background of the MHSW program, as well as review industry funding organization and industry stewardship organizations as it relates to this program. He will also provide an overview of Stewardship Ontario's MHSW program windup history to date, including the minister's direction extending the program and the 2020 to 2021 MHSW windup timeline. He will then review SO's proposed MHSW windup plan program extension addendum, which includes updates to the dates and timelines, as well as any financial implications of the extension. And then afterwards, we will provide a summary of the webinar as well as next steps. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the consultation. So we are reviewing the proposed amendments to the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste Windup Plan regarding the extension of the program operations to September 30th, 2021. And in today's webinar, we will review the proposed program extension addendum and provide stakeholders with the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback to the authority by June 11th. Which is this Friday. Next slide, please. So now I will hand it over to Cameron.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everyone, and good morning. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm Cameron Perrick, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Planning with the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. And today I'll be leading you through a number of slides on the history of the windup of the waste diversion program for MHSW, the authority's process following the receipt of a minister's direction to consult on, assess, and consider approval of the submitted plan addendum, as well as walking the webinar participants through the key elements of the proposed addendum. And as mentioned, we'll pause at regular intervals to respond to questions and comments received through the chat function. Okay, just a brief background. I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the MHSW program, but if you're not, the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste, aka the MHSW program, is operated under the authority of Ontario's Waste Diversion Transition Act 2016, or the WDTA. The program collects the following hazardous or special waste materials and ensures they are managed in an environmentally responsible way at end of life. Single-use batteries, pressurized containers, which includes two subcategories of refillable and non-refillable pressurized containers, automotive materials, oil containers, oil filters, antifreeze and antifreeze containers, and then the paints and coatings, pesticides, solvents, and fertilizers. This will be noted throughout the presentation, but we want to make sure it's crystal clear that the single-use battery program managed by SO wound up on June 30th, 2020, and producers of those materials are now subject to the requirements of the battery regulation under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, or the RRCEA. Next slide, please. And just a little clarification note around how the MHSW program is operated. Because we have industry funding organizations, or IFOs, as well as industry stewardship organizations, ISOs. So under the Waste Diversion Transition Act, Stewardship Ontario is the industry funding organization, or IFO, responsible for operating the MHSW program until it ceases operation. The Act also permits management of such materials by industry stewardship organizations, or ISOs. There are 4 approved industry stewardship plans, or ISPs, operated by various ISOs. Product Care Association operates 2 ISPs, one for paints and coatings, another for pesticides, solvents, and fertilizers. Automotive Material Stewardship, or AMS, operates an ISP for the management of oil filters, oil containers, antifreeze and antifreeze containers, and SodaStream operates an ISP for the management of their own proprietary pressurized containers. Now, SO continues to manage, that's the approved industry funding organization, continues to manage the supply chain for refillable and non-refillable pressurized containers. But they also continue to represent a small number of stewards in some of the other MHSW categories whose supply chain is managed by the ISOs. Next slide, please. So just like to quickly review the wind-up history to date. So on April 12, 2018, the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, who we'll refer to as the Minister throughout this presentation, directed Stewardship Ontario to wind up the MHSW program to enable the transition of the hazardous or special materials to the Individual Producer Responsibility, or IPR, regulatory framework outlined in the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act 2016, or the RRCEA. On December 27, 2019, the authority approved SO's MHSW wind-up plan with conditions. The authority also approved 2 addendums to the SO MHSW wind-up plan related to the distribution of residual funds, which was approved by the authority in February of 2020, and the transfer of surplus funds to the ISOs, approved June 2020. Both were as required by ministerial direction. And again, to reiterate, SO ceased operation of the MHSW program for single-use batteries on June 30th, 2020, which are now subject to the requirements of the battery regulation under the RRCEA. Next slide, please. Now to talk about the most recently received minister's direction, which came as a result of comments the minister received from stakeholders. On April 29th, 2021, SO received a direction to develop amendments to the waste diversion program for MHSW that include the following timelines: that the MHSW program operations would cease on September 30th, 2021, Now that's a 3-month extension from the original wind-up date as required by the minister's original direction that the program wind up June 30th, 2021. SO is to develop and submit an amendment to the MHSW wind-up plan to the authority no later than May 31st, 2021. And the minister expects that the authority will approve the amendment no later than June 30th, 2021, so by the end of this month. Aside from changes necessary to operate the MHSW program for an additional 3 months, all other elements of the MHSW wind-up plan will remain unchanged. And the 3-month extension only applies to designated materials, to all designated materials except for the single-use battery category, which transitioned, as already mentioned, back on June 30th, 2020. Just to give folks a bit of a more visual timeline of the processes as required by this new ministerial direction, as well as wind-up activities that have occurred to date. So following the receipt of the minister's direction on April 29th, SO developed a plan and consulted on the plan from May 18th to the 25th. They also hosted a webinar on May 18th, which opened the consultation period. Following consultation and receipt of stakeholder feedback, on May 28th, SO submitted their proposed MHSW wind-up plan program extension addendum to the authority, which has been assessed to ensure that the proposed plan addendum is sufficiently consistent with the minister's April 29th direction, as well as the authority's wind-up guide, in order for it to be released for the purpose of consultation by the authority. On May 31st, so last week, RIPR posted the proposed program extension addendum to our website and subsequently opened the consultation period on the plan. The consultation period will run from the 31st of May to June 11th, which will also be the deadline for stakeholder feedback to be received on the proposed plan addendum. And as per ministerial direction, the authority will consider approval of the plan by June 30th. And lastly, the MHSW program will cease operation on September 30th, 2021. Next slide, please. So we're just going to pause here. I don't see any questions come in yet through the Q&A box, but do any of the participants have questions regarding the process or timelines to approve SO's proposed addendum? Or do you have any questions regarding the minister's direction itself to SO, extending the MHSW program operations by 3 months to wind up on September 30th, 2021? We'll just pause for a minute for folks to think about any questions they might have.
So Cameron, we got one question here, and it is, what was the underlying reason for the 3-month extension?
Okay, thanks for your question. Good question. Probably a question for the minister, but if I was to make an assumption, it's that we don't have an HSP reg to date, not in a final form. So the extension was likely related to that, to give a little bit more time for folks to plan for the upcoming transition. We're hoping that an HSP reg will be finalized soon. Okay, we've got a question in the chat.
Yeah, so the question is, was the primary driver for the minister's extension AMO's submission, or were there others?
Again, I think that's a question for the minister or the ministry. So I can't answer that myself, as we're a separate entity being the oversight authority. Just wait a few more moments for any other lingering questions before we move on to talk about the addendum itself.
We have a question about, will this slide deck be available after the webinar? And the answer is yes, it will. It will be available on our consultation page, as well as a follow-up email to this webinar.
Okay, let's move on to the next section to discuss the key elements of the proposed addendum. We can just flip right into the next slide. Thanks. So the waste diversion program for MHSW, as mentioned, will continue for an additional 3 months as required by the minister's direction. And instead of winding up on June 30th, 2021, the waste diversion program for MHSW will wind up on September 30th, 2021. All MHSW materials will continue to be collected, transported, processed, and recycled in accordance with the current program standards and performance metrics up until September 30th, 2021. Stewards will be billed for an additional quarter of operations in 2021. So for that Q3 2021 supply period of July 1st, 2021 to September 30th, 2021, stewards will receive an additional invoice. The transition to the RRCEA framework will occur on October 1st, 2021. And these timelines will apply to windup of all designated materials under the waste diversion program for MHSW, except for single-use batteries, which have already transitioned to the producer responsibility framework on June 30th, 2020. Now, following the resolution of all program financial and operational issues, SO is targeting a termination date of June 2022 for submission of the MHSW windup plan final implementation report to RIPRA and the minister. Now, this is the last step in the windup of a waste diversion program, is the final report, which will be submitted to RIPRA and the minister, at which point in time the minister would issue a termination letter to the program operator, to SO, and that's the final step in the windup process. So SO's proposed plan addendum details that the extension of the MHSW program requires that steward and service provider submission deadlines and reporting dates will need to be updated to synchronize with the new date that the MHSW program will cease operations. SO is proposing to keep the sequence and timing of the various reporting dates and deadlines associated with the windup of the MHSW program. So the sequence and timing will be the same as those associated with the approved MHSW windup plan. Everything's just bumped out by 3 months. For stewards, there will be an additional supply report needed to be submitted for the Q3 2021 supplies. The final adjustment request deadline for 2021 supplies has shifted by 3 months from August 31st to November 30th, 2021. NSO will delay the issuance of final invoices after the program ceases operations until December 31st, 2021, to allow SO to assess the final steward supply reports and administrative costs prior to reconciling steward invoices and determining the level of fee reductions able to be applied in each material category. The final steward invoice will be due 1 month later on January 31st, 2022. Looks like there's a raised hand, but we're going to pause for questions following the summarization of the plan that's been submitted to us, and we'll go through questions at that point in time. So whoever's got their hand raised, we'll just hold tight. Okay, for service providers, what does this extension mean for their dates and deadlines? Well, similar to the steward reporting deadlines and invoicing dates, the collection deadlines and claim submission dates have been adjusted to align with a new date that the MHSW program will cease operations. The current service provider contracts will remain in place for the extension period and be terminated in accordance with the contractual notification requirements of those contracts. SO will continue to provide municipalities with payments for municipal depots and collection events until the MHSW program ceases operations on September 30th, 2021. Transporters will have until October 15th to collect obligated pressurized containers received by the collection sites by the wind-up date of September 30th, 2021. So that's the same as the original proposed plan, that they'll have 2 weeks to service those sites following the wind-up date. And the deadline for submission of incentive claims to SO will be November 30th, 2021. Again, a 60-day period following the wind-up date for incentive claims to be submitted by service providers. Next slide, please. So just going to just quickly discuss the supply chains managed by the ISPs and their related agreements, and if there are any impacts of this program extension on those agreements. So SO continues to fulfill its ongoing obligations on behalf of its remaining stewards in the automotive material categories, pesticide, solvents, fertilizers, paints, and coating categories by purchasing tonnage credits for these materials from AMS and PCA, the ISOs that operate supply chain for those materials. ESSO's current agreements with the ISOs, that's AMS and PCA, to purchase tonnage credits on behalf of its remaining stewards in the categories where the supply chain is operated by the ISOs will be managed to accommodate the new wind-up date. And existing invoicing and payment processes will continue until the program ceases operations. Just going to review some of the financial implications of the program extension, starting with program costs. And to clarify, program costs are related to material management and administrative costs borne by stewards. So ongoing MHSW program costs will continue to be financed by stewards via steward fees until the program ceases operation on September 30th, 2021. Stewards will receive 3 quarters of MHSW program operations in 2021 rather than 2 quarters of operations, and will subsequently receive 3 invoices as per the schedule in the proposed addendum. So ESSO continues to target a dispersal of $2.3 million as fee reductions in material categories where material reserves permit. So the total amount forecasted to be distributed as fee reductions is not impacted by the program extension. Instead, it's just spread out over an additional quarter. Next slide, please. So this slide is communicating the actual increase in expense related to program costs. So under the original wind-up plan, there was forecasted to be 6 months of operations, which would have an SSA or a material management and administrative costs around the $2.6, $2.7 million mark, with an additional 3 months of program operations extending out to September 30th, 2021. ESSO is forecasting that the 2021 program costs will be around $4.1 million, so a total increase of $1.4 million, and that's the amount of that third invoice for Q3 2021. And I just want to make a quick note that the steward invoices are actually based on real program costs incurred in each quarter, not the forecast expenses shown here. So there may be a variance from the estimates in the table. So the SSA could come in higher or lower, depending on what is actually occurring in the supply chain, what's actually collected and managed. Next slide, please. So now to speak about general wind-up costs. Under the approved MHSW wind-up plan, general wind-up costs are financed by drawing down from general MHSW reserves. This approach avoids charging stewards directly for wind-up costs. ESSO forecasts that there are sufficient funds in the general reserve to cover the general wind-up expense increase related to an additional 3 months of program operations. ESSO forecasts that the overall increase in general wind-up expenses will be approximately $490,000. Now this number is driven by ESSO's wind-up plan development and implementation item, which is forecasted to increase by $415,000 for that extra 3 months of program operation, as well as RIPRA's oversight fees for that additional 3 months of $75,000. Now, these are 2 critical points that this program extension is not forecasted to impact the ESSO material reserves. Those are the amounts, as mentioned, which will be used to finance fee reductions. And there's also no forecasted impact on the restricted reserves required to be established by AMS and PCA. ESSO also established a restricted reserve as per the ISO surplus fund transfer agreements to fund ESSO's compensable wind-up expenses in the event of a transition delay. So what this also means is that there's enough money left in ESSO's general reserve to finance this $500,000 increase in wind-up costs as it relates to a 3-month extension. Okay, we'd like to just do a quick summary and wrap up and discuss next steps for this consultation. So the MHSW program operations continue for 3 additional months, and the transition to the RRCEA framework for these materials will be delayed until October 1st, 2021. There are updates to reporting dates and deadlines for stewards and service providers, but the sequence and timing of the dates and deadlines will remain the same as in the originally approved MHSW wind-up plan, but the dates are adjusted by 3 months, so pushed out by 3 months to be consistent with the new wind-up date in September. Following the resolution of all program financial and operational issues, ESO is targeting a June 2022 date for submission of their final wind-up report to RIPRA and the Minister. In terms of financial implications, the big one is that stewards will be billed an additional quarter's worth of program costs in 2021 for the Q3 2021 supply period of July 1st, 2021 to September 30th, 2021. And MHSW wind-up costs are forecasted to increase by approximately $490,000. But as just mentioned, there's sufficient funds remaining in the general reserve to cover this expense related to the program extension, and there's no expected impact on the material or restricted reserves. Okay, let's pause for some questions, and perhaps the person with the raised hand can either type their question into the Q&A box, or I'm not sure, Michelle, if we have the ability to let the person ask a question. But everyone else who's thinking about their questions, we're looking for questions on the MHSW program operations continuing for an additional 3 months, questions about updates to the key dates and deadlines for stewards and service providers, as well as questions regarding the key financial implications of this program extension. I'll just pause, let people think about questions or comments they might have. I don't see anything coming in. Maybe we answered the person who raised their hand. Maybe their question's been answered. Okay, we've got a question. Can RIPRA go over the $1.4 million figure again? Sure, I think that's a pretty simple one. So the $1.4 million is the SSA for Q3 2021. So that's the forecasted amount of material management and admin costs for operating the program for another 3 months. So that cost will be spread amongst all of the ESO stewards in relation to their supplied amounts. And Marceline, if that's not clear, please feel free to send us an email and we can chat further about that. If it's still unclear what the $1.4 million relates to.
We have another question, Cameron, from Stephen, and he understands the extension and then asks, how can an ISO better understand RRCEA going forward?
That's a good question. I mean, at this point in time, if we're speaking about the RRCEA, the HSP reg, the hazardous or special products regulation, is not finalized yet. So in terms of I think the ISOs and all producers will gain a far better understanding of their operations or how they're going to fulfill their regulatory obligations under the RRCA once that HSP reg is finalized. So I'm not going to wade into that one yet, as we don't have a finalized reg, but it is expected to be released soon. And as with the other transitions, RIPRA will strive to communicate to obligated producers what their compliance requirements will be, and make sure that the folks are equipped with all the information they need to be compliant and to register and fulfill their regulatory obligations under any regulation made under the RRCA. Okay, another question about the finances. So I'm just trying to reconcile the 1.4 million versus the forecasted 490,000 for 3 months of program operations. Okay, so two different expense items. Let's start with the 490,000. So that is an amount that is being drawn down from the general reserve. So the general reserve is an amount shared by all MHSW program participants. So all stewards and ISP members. And the general reserve was created in a very conservative manner so that there was enough money for just such an occurrence of a potential program extension. So the general reserve is going to be drawn down by $490,000 to cover the 3 months worth of wind-up expenses. So that's the wind-up plan implementation, development implementation, as well as RIPRA's oversight fees. That's separate from the program operations, which is the cost to actually collect, manage, and administer the MHSW program, which is forecasted to be billed out to stewards, to SO stewards at a price tag of $1.4 million for the 3 months of operations from July 1st to September 30th. And the $490,000 is not billed to stewards. Those are coming out of the existing SO general reserves. We do have Doug Mander and Howard Morrison from SO, and you guys don't have to jump in, but if you could provide any clarity, please do so on the $1.4 million program cost increase. But if I've already covered it, then no need. It sounds like it may still be a little bit unclear.
Cameron, I think the program cost estimates are just based on the best information we have about anticipated supply into the market for that final quarter, the Q3. But as you mentioned at the top of the presentation, these are it's a cost-based program. So what will be billed for that quarter will be based on actual supply and actual costs incurred for that quarter. So SO does its best to try and forecast, what we expect the supply and cost to be, but there's always some potential for variation. So it could be a little bit less than the 1.4. It could be slightly more at the end of the day, but it's roughly in keeping with the costs we've been incurring in the program to date.
Great, thanks for the clarification, Doug.
For those raising their hand, can you please use the Q&A function so we can answer your question?
Okay, we've got one more question from Pat from PCA, just confirming that the 1.4 million includes the 490,000, and it does not. So the 1.4 million is going to be billed out to SO stewards. That's the SSA, that's the forecasted SSA for the management of the materials collected in the marketplace for Q3 2021. The 490,000 is a separate amount that is drawn down from the existing general reserves. Hopefully that clarifies those two amounts and what they relate to.
Okay, well, if we don't have any other questions, we can move on. So before we move on to the next steps, we're actually going to launch a quick poll to gather some stakeholder feedback on today's webinar. So this gives us a good understanding of how helpful this webinar was, as well as highlight any ways we can enhance our approach to webinars moving forward. So I'll launch the poll now, and we appreciate your participation. I'll keep it live for about 30 seconds. Okay, thank you, everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, so next steps. So you may provide your feedback on the proposed program extension addendum by emailing your comments to consultations@rpra.ca. To review the consultation materials from today, we will be adding them to our current consultation webpage and also be sending you a follow-up email this afternoon. Stakeholder feedback is due by June 11th, 2021, which is this Friday. And consultation participants will be notified when the addendum is approved. And the approval will also be on our website. And for more information on the MHSW program wind-up in general, please visit our Hazardous and Special Waste program page. So thank you on behalf of everyone at RPRA for joining today's webinar. And again, if you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to us through the email consultations@rpra.ca. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.